Good evening, everybody. For those of you who don't know me, Major Jordan Hayes. I'm the squadron commander over at 188 in Oakland. And I'm also the wing deputy director of communications. Tonight, we are going to be talking about mishap reporting. Everybody see that? Seems right. Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Yes.
Yep.
So there's a lot to talk about for mishap reporting. We're going to try to just focus on the stuff that's relevant to the 70-5 training. And so for you aircrew folks. So obvious first question is, what's a mishap? We can look in the regulation 160-2, which is current as of September 2019. Mishap is any occurrence or series of occurrences that results in damage or injury. Any damage or injury is evidence that a mishap has occurred, even if the precipitating occurrence or cause is not known. So even if you don't know how it happened, it's still a mishap. All mishaps must be reported. So notice that that's a regulatory requirement. It's actually in a regulation. It says all mishaps must be reported. It's not optional. CAPR 160-2 is a 16-page document. It's well worth, in my opinion, a periodic read. Safety is at the core of everything we do in CAP. Tonight's 20-minute talk will not make you an expert. And like they say, you aren't required to memorize the regulations, but you are required to follow them. So ignore this advice at your own peril. Okay, so mishap is damage or injury. So what are these two things? What's an injury and what's damage? An injury, for the purposes of mishap reporting, thus the context here, an injury is any occurrence of or evidence of physical trauma or damage to the body, either internal or external, that occurs in the context of a CAP activity or mission. And it goes on to say that the context includes the activity itself as well as planning, preparation, and travel associated with the activity. So you're driving home from the airport, you got your non-distress find, and you run your car into a lamppost, and you bump your head. That's both injury and damage, because it's within the context of the CAP activity. Damage, similarly, any physical harm, breakage, marring, or unintended change to a vehicle, aircraft, facility, or other piece of real or personal property. This includes any damage to CAP property, regardless of the cause, or damage to private property that may occur during a CAP activity or mission, with the same caveat above. The activity as well as planning, preparation, and travel associated with the activity. So who's responsible for reporting a mishap? Just like who's responsible for safety, everybody's a safety officer. Members at every level are responsible for reporting any mishap when they witness the mishap or see evidence that a mishap has occurred. This includes reporting to leadership as well as reporting in SIRS or SEERS. I don't know how people pronounce that these days. 5.2.1 says whenever a mishap is observed, the member should ensure that it's called to the attention of the commander or any available member of the leadership staff. So if it's at a meeting, it's the squadron commander. If you're at some kind of an event, it's the activity director. If you're in a mission or a training mission, it's the incident commander, who may also have a safety officer working for them, etc. What do you do if you can't figure out who to tell? Anybody? Like maybe you're in a situation where none of those things directly apply. I was trying to think of one tonight. What about if you are the transportation officer and you go to check the vehicle on the monthly basis to see how much mileage there was or something like that, and a mishap happens then? Who do you tell?
Commander?
It seems like your
Yeah,
unit
start with the
commander would be
commander.
fine.
Commander would be good. Yep.
The group safety officer?
Could be the group safety officer. Absolutely. So this is one of those ones you got to kind of use your best judgment. Think about who might want to know. Think about if you were that person, would you want to know? Make sure you tell somebody though. Don't just go home. Okay, so are you sure it's a mishap? Here's an example. Member trips on a chalk, skins their knee and palm, stands up, brushes themselves off, and continues on. You say, "Are you okay?" And they say, "Yep, fine, let's go." Is that a mishap?
No.
Are you sure?
Well, it's damage to their body. I mean, I guess it is.
Let's move on. Here's another example. Mission observer drops an iPad on the ground. A crack is observed in the case in the back. Is it a new crack? We're not sure. You say, "Does it still work?" And they say, "Yeah, the front display is fine. Let's go." What do you do if you're not sure if it's a mishap? And here's the mantra I'm going to give you.
When in doubt,
When in
report it.
doubt, make the call. Make the call. What's the call? You don't need to think about, is this an injury? Is this damage? Is this a mishap? Do I have to log into e-services? Is there paperwork? Operators are standing by 24/7. Even if you're absolutely sure it's reportable, you'll have the voice of experience on the other end of the line who can help. So my advice to you, don't do it alone. Make the phone call. In the worst case, you get to have a spirited discussion with an experienced CAP member who's probably the wing safety officer, the DO, the vice commander, the wing commander. Who knows? You might get to talk to the region commander. That's always fun.
Can you define DO,
Talk to
please?
him all the time.
That is the director of operations. And if it's deemed to be reportable, you'll be given more details about how and when to do the report. If you've never done one of these, you might wonder, how do I find out? Well, you're not going to learn in 20 minutes. But if you make this phone call and they say, "Yep, that's a mishap, we're going to have to report this. Here's how we'll do it," and they'll work with you to make sure it gets done correctly and completely. So make the call. What do you got to lose? Do not head straight for Sears in e-services unless told to do so. Don't go filling out a form just saying, "Well, I don't want to bother anybody about this. I got to fill out the form." Don't do that. So how do we make this phone call? By now, you should be familiar with mobiletools.pcrcap.org. There's a whole bunch of good stuff on there, more every day. On the right-hand side there, near the bottom, is one that says mishap report. You click on that, and what you'll get is on the right here, the mishap reporting process. This is standardized across all of Pacific region. It's the same phone number. When it answers, press 2 for California. It figures out who's available, who's on duty, who can take your call. Call now. You just press that button, that little call now button, and it should work on your phone. It's a good idea to put this number in your contacts because maybe you can get to it faster than you can get to mobile tools. But what's the advice again? When in doubt, make a call. You'll have a nice conversation. What happens after that? So remember, we saw this earlier, 521 says, whenever the mishap is observed, the manager should ensure that it is called to the attention of this person. And making that phone call, that counts. So what do you want to do next? My advice to you is think about, should you tell anybody else? Don't surprise your boss. So in the example of the vehicle that you encounter and there's a mishap about it, you're not sure who to call or who to tell, so you call the number and they say, "Yep, it's a mishap. I'll help you fill it out, help you fill out the paper, blah, blah, blah." Should you tell anybody else at that point? I would say you should probably tell the person who's most responsible for the vehicle that their vehicle has been involved in it. So it's not ASAP, right? But you don't want the person who's responsible for the vehicle to find out from someone else that something happened to the vehicle and they didn't tell you. So try not to surprise your boss. Okay, so aircraft mishap reporting is where we'll spend a little time now. So 541 says any mishap involving a CAP aircraft or member-owned aircraft, which is used in a CAP mission or activity, which is exceedingly rare these days, will be reported as an aircraft mishap in Sears. This includes powered aircraft, gliders, and balloons, no matter what the aircraft is. Any injuries resulting from an aircraft mishap, including aircrew, passengers, or other individuals not in the aircraft, right? It could be somebody on the ground that you taxied by and there was some FOD and they were injured somehow. So it doesn't have to just be folks in the cab crew, will be reported. Any aircraft or property damage or injury that results from the ground movement of an aircraft will be reported as an aircraft mishap. Finally, any aircraft damage that is discovered during a pre-flight or any other time that is not associated with flight will be reported as an aircraft mishap, even when the cause of the damage is unknown. We had a really good one a couple of years ago. The aircraft over at Palo Alto had a big dent in the top of the wing from a golf ball, probably from a golf ball because it's right next to the golf course over there. When did it happen? Nobody knows. Did the plane even fly? In between the time that it got hit and it got seen? Maybe. But the person who eventually found it reported it. So there's a little bit of a bummer that comes along with this, which is that there's an automatic suspension in a lot of cases. So 8.2 says any crew member, so not just the pilot, but any crew member involved in an aircraft mishap as defined previously in 5.1 is automatically suspended from flying as a crew member until a commander in their chain of command or an incident commander during a supervised mission has been apprised of the circumstances of the mishap. So pretty much the idea is if there's a mishap with an aircraft, everything comes grinding to a halt. There's no flying, there's no participating as a crew member. It's automatic. You don't have to wait for someone to tell you. You just know because that's what the regulation says. Everybody is suspended from flying. A little bit further on this, if it turns out that the mishap appears to have been caused by crew action or inaction, that creates an ongoing concern. So this is an important detail here regarding the readiness for continued flying duties. So for instance, willful violation, excessive risk tolerance, disregard for procedures, lack of proficiency, those kinds of things. The commander shall, they've got no choice, but to suspend those specific crew members for cause using the procedures. Now, the trick here is you don't have to wait to run the month-long review process to figure out if that's true. It's within the purview of the commander to say, hey, this would be reckless to continue at this point. Also, if it appears that the mishap can be defined as an accident, and we're going to talk about the difference between an accident and a mishap soon, but there's other things that have to happen there. Again, I advise you to read this document.
Sorry, one thing. So A2 and A21, I mean, A2 says you get automatically suspended, then A21 says you shall be suspended. So like, when would A21 apply that A2 doesn't?
In 8.2.3, which is the next slide.
Okay.
Okay, coming right up. So the good news is that if 8.2.1 doesn't apply, that is, that it does not appear to have been caused by crew action or inaction that creates an ongoing concern, you can get reinstated directly. You get a get out of jail free card. So if a review of the initial mishap information indicates that 8.2.1 and 8.2.2 are not met, the commander shall verbally reinstate the member's flying privileges. So the automatic part kicks in, everybody stops, you report it, you talk about it, the commander figures out, hey, was this willful? Is this trouble? Would it be reckless to let these folks get reinstated right away? And if not, then you'll get ungrounded right there on the spot. Before any paperwork is done, before anything, the idea is you don't get to decide whether or not it was serious enough to warrant continued suspension. So in the vast majority of cases, so for instance, if something happens that's it's out of your control, I guess there's people on the call tonight who had examples where, and we'll get into the list of things that are reportable later, but they had a reportable incident and they called them and they said, yep, that just sometimes happens. And so it wasn't your fault, as far as we know. And so, yes, the plane is flyable and you're comfortable flying it, please fly it home. That kind of thing.
Can you go
All right.
back a slide for a second?
Yes. So, right. So it's a little tricky.
So, because
So
this
when-
8.2 says, until a commander, blah, 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 it has been apprised.
Right. And
So
and
that says,
during
I
the
read that to
apprising,
mean, yeah, okay, after they're apprised, it's lifted, is what I read.
No, in the at the moment of appraisal, let's we can get super legal on this. One of three things gets apprised. Either 821, 822, or 823 applies. One of those three, right? They can the initial interaction. Whoever's been told about this gets to decide. Does it appear to have been caused by something that creates an ongoing concern? Does it appear to be an accident? And if it's not, 823 says if it's not that thing and it's not an accident, then everybody gets ungrounded at the end of the, presuming, the plane is flyable and it's safe to fly it and everything else makes sense. You get that?
I don't think it's written right. I think 8.2 is in conflict with 8.2.3. I understand the intention, but apprised means told, and number 8.2.1 says commander shall suspend. So clearly the commander could immediately suspend. That's fine after apprisal. But the 8.2.2 says, or the next one you had on the slide said, will reinstate. But It's been automatically reinstated as a consequence of the apprisal.
No, there's no automatic reinstatement. There's just automatic suspension.
Well, it says until the commander has been apprised.
You are automatically suspended until the commander gets apprised, and then
apprised
one
means
the
told.
one of the next three things happens.
And all of them mention commander.
Anybody on the call here had this happen to them and can say with certainty what the time between 8.2 and 8.2.3 was for them? It's a little bit atomic, but it's not, it's not down to the millisecond. There's a conversation and there's a determination, and it happened, but it happens right then. Also, this is probably not the first time you've encountered some vagueness with a CAP regulation. So long as you understand how this actually goes, right? So you have a mishap, you are automatically suspended. You then get in contact with someone, apprise them of the situation. They will make a determination whether it's 821, 822, 823. Is that clear? I'm gonna move on. So that's the normal thing. It doesn't have to happen that way. It could be 821 or 822, in which case you are still suspended. And there's a whole bunch of other things that happen in that process outside of the scope of tonight's talk. So those are the what happens with aircraft mishap reportable events. Right? Is that what I said? Aircraft mishap reporting, right? So there are also things that are not mishaps, but are still reportable. These are not considered mishaps, and the reporting of these events does not require the automatic suspension in 8.2. So for instance, malfunctions or failures which result in an aborted takeoff and or flight cancellation after the aircrew has completed the before takeoff check. Right? So that's effectively once the sortie started, but somehow the flight got canceled. airborne malfunctions or system failures which result in mission degradation, which is defined as inability to safely perform the mission as briefed, an aborted or shortened mission, or an unplanned divert to a field other than the intended destination, the declaration of an in-flight emergency, or even the reception of priority handling from air traffic control. So maybe you don't declare an emergency, but you call them up and ask them for priority handling because you'd like to get back to base, something like that. That is also not a mishap, but it is reportable. Here are some more. Failures or malfunctions of flight controls, including trim and or autopilot malfunctions. This would include the G1000 crash that happened a couple of months ago. Very interesting story. The in-flight failure of any part of the electrical system of the aircraft that cannot be resolved in flight. So a popped circuit breaker that won't reset, that kind of thing. A dead alternator. I'm looking at you, Mike Gross. When in doubt, to allow tracking of possible trends, aircrews are encouraged to report any aircraft anomaly that negatively affects the mission or requires a workaround. A lot of that, I think, these days goes through the maintenance officers and the write-ups on the aircraft. But if it's interesting enough from a safety standpoint, please also report it through safety channels. Any medical issues which occur in flight which incapacitate an aircrew member or degrade the performance of an aircrew member will also be reported. It's not a mishap, but it will be reported. Normal air sickness episodes which do not result in early termination of the mission are not included. Usually air sickness does result in early termination of the mission. So I can't believe that this happens very much. Also, any near midair is to be reported for tracking and review. The FAA defines it as in-flight separation between two aircraft or aircraft and a drone, less than 500 feet, or the pilot deems it necessary to take evasive action to avoid a collision or a hazardous situation. This is a good example of where a CAP regulation actually defers to a higher source of information. Check out the AIM, specifically 763. Okay, now we can talk about accidents. So accidents are actually another place where CAP defers to the FAA. 49 CFR 830, any aircraft, including glider mishap, which results in the death or serious injury to a person or substantial damage to the aircraft. So serious injury generally includes broken bones, internal injuries, serious burns, or injuries requiring hospitalization. And substantial damage generally includes damage to the aircraft that affects the structural strength of the aircraft or its flight characteristics. That would include internal damage to ribs and spars of the fuselage or wings, or damage to flight controls serious enough to require extensive repair or replacement. There's a lot of wiggle words there, a lot of vague, but I think substantial damage is one. It's you'll know it when you see it. In these cases, the CAP NOC, the National Operations Center, must be notified immediately, and by making the call, they will help you do that. The telephone number is in the regulation, but these are things that have to be reported to the NOC. Do not confuse mishap and accident. It's easy to do. It's actually in the regulation. 5.6, the term accident has specific meaning in aviation. It talks about that a little bit, and it should not be used in conversation as a synonym for a mishap or an incident. Incident is a term they don't define. So there's another good example where these regulations are worth every penny you paid for them. But I think there's some specific legal and liability reasons to not use the word accident if it's not actually an accident. As a reminder, CAP members on scene must not speak to the media on behalf of CAP. or speculate as to the nature or cause of an accident. It is proper to say, I don't know, or I can't speculate when asked. Refer all the media inquiries to CAP National Safety Officer or CAP Marketing and Communications, which is what they're now calling public affairs, for someone who is authorized to speak on behalf of CAP. Again, there's a lot more to this. A little light reading. 5.7 is about SUAS mishaps. 5.8 is vehicle mishaps. 5.9 is bodily injury mishap reporting. 5.10 is facility or property mishap reporting. There are some additional things that the NOC wants to hear from us about. Anytime a powered aircraft is required to make an off-airport landing due to mechanical or other issues, weather or fuel planning. Reporting anytime a powered aircraft unintentionally departs the prepared surface of a runway or taxiway. Report anytime a glider unintentionally departs the prepared surface of a runway or taxiway, resulting in damage to the aircraft or airport property. You glider folks out there know that sometimes gliders don't stay on the taxiway, but so long as it didn't get damaged, it's not something you have to tell the NOC about. Any aircraft engine stoppage that occurs while airborne. Anytime a CAP aircraft is the subject of an FAA reported near midair. Anytime there's a media inquiry regarding a mishap or other safety-related event or occurrence, if the event might reasonably expect it to bring negative media, including social media, attention to CAP. Here's an interesting one. Anytime there's an inquiry from a general officer or equivalent civilian of any military or other uniformed service, including the National Guard, Coast Guard, Public Health Service, related to any CAP mishap or safety concern. So you're on a flight line and a guy wearing a Coast Guard flight suit walks up to you and asks you a question that has a safety implication. The NOC wants to know about it. And of course, anytime there's a safety-related inquiry from a federal, state, or local government official regarding a specific CAP activity or occurrence. So these are things where it's a concerned question, not a curious question. Routine contact from the FSDO is excluded from the requirement, but if the mayor of the town walks up during an air show and says, is that safe for a cadet to be standing next to the propeller there? That's something the NOC wants to know about. Okay, I'm over my time, but does anybody have any questions that might not be reasonably answered by reading the document? Let's see. I got a question for. One question was, how about a bird strike? Absolutely. That is a mishap. Will be automatically suspended for that. If the plane's still flyable, you probably will be reinstated.
And there was an earlier question about a golf ball. So the golf ball one also applies, right?
Absolutely.
Damage to the aircraft, right?
Absolutely.
If I could add to the golf cart comment.
Yeah, you were probably there.
It happened on my watch as commander back in 2013, I believe. So as you know, Palo Alto Golf Squadron is right next to the golf course. There were numerous golf ball hits to the airplane, and pilot noticed it on pre-flight. So this is a very interesting scenario here. So the pilot's not grounded because the pilot, didn't do anything. So it was an observation at pre-flight at the time. And I managed to, as the squadron commander, right, he went to me because there was no incident commander, as Jordan went over. There was no any other chain of command mission person or DO responsible here. So where do you go? Jordan said it. You go to your commanding officer. And I actually submitted a loss form to the county, the city of Palo Alto. And the city of Palo Alto actually paid the sum of about $4,000 to Civil Air Patrol for the replacement of the skin of the airplane. So there are, cause and effect there, but just that's the golf ball incident there. Again, the pilot, crew, not involved on it, pre-flight inspection. Okay, observation, who do you go to? So something to think about.
Thanks, Pete.
Well, thank you, Jordan. I really appreciate it.
You bet.
And we'll continue on with the rest of our program unless anybody else has any last questions. Okay, so let me bring up, I'm going to go ahead and do video back off again just for bandwidth, and we'll bring up our next section. Okay. Can everyone see my slide deck?
Yes, sir. Yep.
Okay. All right, so rest of module 5. Okay, what we're going to cover, we're going to look at Form 70-5 task criteria, the specifics of where the standards are that you must meet during a Form 5 evaluation. We'll talk about some tips and common errors for aerial maneuvers, as well as takeoffs and landings. It's by no means fully inclusive. Just wanted to cover some of the major areas and the areas that we typically, there are typically issues in. Okay, we're going to talk briefly about the Aircraft Information File, or AIF. A little bit on aircraft maintenance. I promise to be quick. And then our mishap reporting, which was our separate module, thanks to Major Hayes. Okay, so where do we find our task criteria? Well, it kind of depends on what the task is. There are 2 different types of sections on the Form 5. There are sections that are specified as ACS tasks, or Airman Certification Standards, that come from the FAA. Or there are CAP tasks. Okay, so FAA ACS tasks are based on the Airman Certification Standards. For those of you who've been flying for a while, you probably remember this as Practical Test Standards, or PTS. I have a link here that's available, and these slides will be available afterwards. Here's where you can get them all. You can also Google as well, usually finds them. And as an example, this is what they look like for a private pilot. And we also will be utilizing the commercial ACS for those pilots who are commercially rated. They will meet the commercial pilot standards. And then for the instrument related task, we will be using the instrument ACS. Okay, let's take a look at a particular example of how we take an ACS task. And if you look at the name, Airworthiness Requirements, there is actually inside the ACS, you will find an item that matches, for example, in this case, Airworthiness Requirements. Now, I've highlighted the skills section, but let me emphasize that everything that is on this page, you as a pilot being evaluated for a CAP Form 5 are responsible for. So the knowledge sections apply as well, but I'm specifically focusing tonight just on the skills section. What we're looking for is this is what you are required to demonstrate, right, to prove that you have the ability to complete this task. But again, knowledge component, any of the knowledge component questions are certainly fair game. Okay, and I want to drill down a little bit further, because for the maneuvers that we do, you'll find that most of them have a maintain item under the skills section, usually the last one. And what they're telling you here is, here are the standards you must do to maintain. Now, it's not to say that all the other steps aren't important, because you have to, for example, 2 steps up from this, roll into a coordinated 360-degree steep turn. The key emphasis word here being coordinated, right? That is an expectation. But what we find is that the problem areas typically on Form 5 rides are in maintaining the actual maneuver in these standards. So that's why I emphasize it. Again, like my comment on the knowledge section, it's not that all of it is not important and that you aren't responsible for, but tonight we're trying to be a little more focused, and we're going to look at those things. Now, I'm not going to go through the specifics for each and every maneuver. All right, and I'm also not going to do it for the different ratings because for those of you who are commercially rated pilots, you know that the standards are about half or twice as tight, if you will, for the steep turns for a commercial pilot, as well as the fact that the bank angle is steeper, for example. Now for cap tests, we find these, and this is new. This happened with the rewrite of Form 70, or excuse me, Regulation 70-1 last March, almost a year now. The cap tests are now defined. They have actual criteria in CAP Standard 72-6. And what they look like is for a given task, you can find the equivalent number inside 72-6. And what they will do is show you for the different levels, qualified or qualified with training or unsatisfactory, right? And these items were covered earlier. In fact, I believe Captain Stieber in his presentation on the 70-5 kind of went through these categories. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the categories themselves. Again, focus tonight is a little more on practical tips and suggestions. But again, be familiar with 72-6. This talks about what you need to be able to demonstrate to successfully accomplish the task. Okay, let's get to the fun part. Let's talk about maneuvers. Preparation. These are just some general items I want to present to you. So we're not going to focus on stepwise procedures because there are a lot of other good references. Of course, the POH is the primary reference always. Not every maneuver that you'll have to do, though, is identified in the POH. Also, another excellent reference is Group 2 has published a maneuver procedure guide. And here's a link to it. It's on our Group 2 DOV website. And again, the link is in the file, slides here. And these slides will be on the team site. So what we're going to focus on are practical tips here. All right. Raise the wing to clear turns. Obviously, I'm referring to CAP aircraft that we typically fly, which are high wing aircraft. This doesn't apply for your Piper Arrow or Piper Archer. But I will tell you, I expect this. I think most of the check pilots in the group will expect this. We expect you to look where you're going before you make a turn and to clear that. And on the same topic, we expect you to clear the airspace prior and between maneuvers. This is also a CAP special interest item that's come up with the new, when it came out with the new standards. This is an important topic. If you're not doing this, it can be a Form 5 disqualification error. Okay. Checklists. Use an appropriate checklist before and after maneuvers as appropriate. For example, if you're going to do an approach to landing or power off stall, you're approaching the landing. Probably a pre-landing checklist would be a good one to execute. How about after you recover from the maneuver and we're going back into cruise flight, right? Again, a cruise checklist would be appropriate. So again, make sure you're referring to the appropriate checklist to make sure that all the items that you need to do have been cleaned up or have been prepared. Sorry, prepared or cleaned up.
Hi, Keith, I have a question.
Absolutely.
Can you please clarify the second last bullet when you say clearing the airspace prior and between maneuvers? What's the exact expectation of the check pilot on that, please?
Well, and most of us have been taught there's either you might do 90-degree turns to clear the air around you, or you might do a complete 360-degree turn. What we're looking for is that not a steep turn, but I would call it a less than 30-degree bank turn. You are clearing the airspace around you. And again, verbalize. Let the check pilot know what you're doing. I'm going to clear airspace now. I'm going to look around. Looking down at your MFD and saying the ADSB says I'm clear is not satisfactory. You actually need to do a visual look around the aircraft. You need to turn the aircraft and look.
Okay, so say that,
Antonio? Yeah,
thank you. So say that I'm doing a steep turn first, and then I'm asked to do like a slow turn. So I would have to clear the airspace twice. Is that right?
You know, here's a point where you definitely want to clear your area before you start doing maneuvers. Beyond that, it becomes a little bit of a judgment call. The best thing to do is to tell your check pilot what you have in mind, or you can even ask, but if you haven't looked around the aircraft recently, and keep in mind the problem with a steep turn is you're requiring so much concentration on control of the aircraft. Are you really clearing the airspace while you're making that 45 or 50-degree bank turn? I think it's kind of a judgment call. I will never say anything to a person who continually clears, in between every maneuver and everything else. But on the other hand, if you are continually turning, you're staying in a small area, then all of that time you're clearing. It doesn't have to be a dedicated clearing turn. I don't know if I can be any more specific than that.
Yeah.
I think that most examiners will know pretty quick whether you're dealing with a pilot who is keeping a vigilant scan of the sky around them or someone who basically never has their eyes out of the cockpit. It's usually pretty clear.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. And on that topic, eyes outside. Other than when we have you on, in foggles or under the hood or flight by referenced instruments, the vast majority of the time, we expect you to keep your eyes outside. You're certainly welcome to use your instruments as backup, but these are the parts of these that are not the instrument maneuvers are all VFR flight maneuvers. So we expect your eyes to be outside the cockpit the majority of the time. And believe it or not, instructors can tell the difference. We know where you're looking, right? So plan to have your eyes outside the cockpit. That's where you should be.
Two comments?
Go for it, George.
Yeah, so interestingly, we know where you're looking without even looking at your eyes. If I see your nose going up and down all the time, chasing the altitude, I only look at your eyes to confirm that you're not looking outside. Because looking outside it gives you the very first and fastest indication that something is changing. So if you're chasing, especially you're behind the plane, that's a indication. Of course, we also look at your eyes to confirm. And also, just maybe a little funny story, but I had one applicant, and I don't remember who, thankfully before the maneuver, said that, steep turns are a self-clearing maneuver. So I don't need clearing turns. I hadn't heard that term before, but no, it doesn't exist. Steep turns are not a clearing turn. They are a maneuver. Sorry, that's it. That's what I have.
Thank you. No, I was going to say, actually, good point, George. On lesson number one when I have new instrument students, is I explain to them, keep in mind the instruments don't tell you what's happening; they tell you what just happened. So it is really the best measure is really looking out. So anyway, thank you, George. Okay. And keep in mind, all phases of airwork maneuvers must remain above 1,500 feet AGL. So that doesn't mean you start at 1,500 feet. It means that you're above it. Now, most of us, we probably do our airwork at least in the neighborhood of 3,000, 3,500. It's fine, but it's always good to have this reminder. And now keep in mind, it is also AGL. So just being, we do have hills around us. Just being at 3,000 feet is not a guarantee you're at 1,500 feet AGL. Okay, let's talk about some specific maneuvers. Maneuvering during slow flight. Okay, so from the ACS, and this is one that seems to cause some confusion. Okay, establish and maintain an airspeed, which any further increase in angle of attack or load factor or reduction in power would result in a stall warning. Okay, so I get asked all the time during prep flights, well, what airspeed? I'm like, I don't know. I mean, I can give you an approximate, but the truth is you don't necessarily know. And for that reason, I have no problem as a person slows the aircraft. If they get to the point where the stall warning horn chirps, that's fine. But the issue is you can't stay in the stall warning horn. The whole objective is to stay above the stall warning horn, but not so much as that you're in cruise flight. It should only be in the neighborhood of about 5 knots above where you were getting the stall warning horn. And again, keep in mind that number changes as things like angle of attack and load factor. So as you tend to change your pitch, if we ask you to do a bank turn, which we will, right, your load factor is changing. So it will change what that actual airspeed is, which is why I can't give you a specific number. But the issue is what we're looking for is fine control of the aircraft at slow airspeeds, or what we used to call minimum controllable airspeed, MCA, right? So again, stall warning horn can go on. However, it should only be as a initial part of the maneuver where you're looking to kind of feel your way to where that airspeed is going to be, or where that airspeed you're going to maintain is for maneuvering during slow flight. On G1000 aircraft, consider setting your heading and altitude bugs as a reminder. One of the common problems, common errors that we have with slow flight are people start to, well, they either sink or they gain altitude, right? I mean, it's basically altitude control. And it's a question of, sometimes it's a question of just having a bug on the instrument panel will give you a quick reminder. So if you've got it on the G1000 equipment, use it there, particularly with the heading bug, because I find when people leave a heading bug not in the direction that they're going, say it's 20 or 30 degrees off, they tend to wander towards it. But remember, we're evaluating you on, if we're telling you to maintain a level attitude, right? We're evaluating you on your ability to hold a heading. So we're expecting that you're not going to drift towards that heading bug unless the heading bug is right where you're right underneath where you're at. So again, I recommend using it. Okay, and as I mentioned, altitude control is a typical problem that we see. Often it's caused by the poor entry technique. So here's some recommendations. Not the only way to do this, but go ahead and bring the power back. Once you have a stabilized aircraft, you're ready to set the power back to allow the aircraft to slow. As the aircraft starts to slow and you decide to add each notch of flaps, go ahead and retrim the aircraft at that point. So you're not fighting the aircraft. We'd rather you not take a half hour to get to slow flight, but on the other hand, there's not a super rush to do it either. So retrim the aircraft after each change of flaps so you're not fighting it. The whole objective here for successful maneuvers, this is all of the maneuvers, is that you're not fighting the aircraft in order to maintain the maneuver that you're executing. So again, retrim the aircraft. That's a recurring theme you'll hear. Okay, once full flaps are deployed and aircraft is nearing target airspeed, expect to add power. And in the case, particularly the 182 more than the 172, 206 more than the 182, it's a significant amount of power because you have a lot of drag out there. And consistently what we see is people just start to sink. And because they're just not adding the required power that's needed in order to do that. And you may find that you added power to arrest the descent, and then you need to bring the power back again a little bit as you adjust your pitch to maintain that airspeed just above the stall warning horn. All right. Another problem is people are not, and goes back to the same thing we're talking about, not adequately looking outside to detect changes in pitch. If you're trying to maintain this by looking at your attitude indicator, you're always going to be chasing the aircraft. The truth is you need to look outside, decide how much blue you're seeing and how much brown you're seeing, and adjust accordingly. Your angle of attack is increasing as you enter this maneuver. Think rudder. Again, this is one of those things that you just need to anticipate. Anytime you start to put the nose in the air, particularly when you're at slower airspeeds and higher power, you can pretty much expect that you're going to do some rudder activity. Wake those feet up, because lack of coordinated flight is coordinated flight is a requirement of these tasks. In fact, correct me here if I'm wrong, George, I think this will be true. Pretty much the only time during your flight maneuvers where we're going to accept that you're not in coordinated flight is when you're executing a slip. I'm just running through thinking if that's true. I think that's pretty much true. In every
Yeah.
other case.
I don't remember an exception, and there are good reasons for that. But yeah.
Yes, and we'll get into some of those important reasons soon. Okay, let's move into the power off or approach to landing stall. When I write it, you'll normally see me and you'll actually hear me say it most of the time, even on a check ride when I say, okay, I'd like you to demonstrate a power off or approach to landing stall. Yes, it is referred to as a power off stall in the ACS, but and which kind of surprises me because the FAA is all about, reasonable scenarios and realistic scenarios in training. Because what we are simulating, or what the scenario is on a power off stall, is the approach to landing. So I want you to think about it. Think about it from the perspective of you're coming into land. It's not just a question of yank the power back, maybe the flaps are in or not, and then you just pull the yoke back. If you think about it in terms of you're coming into land and this is the scenario, set the aircraft up appropriately. Okay. Notice from the ACS, establish a stabilized descent as if you were coming into landing. I do find that most people actually are flying straight and level. They slow the aircraft and plan to go into a power off stall, right? That is not what the maneuver is. So you set up a stabilized descent. This is not a place where we're going to say, oh, you started descending, you failed because you weren't within 100 feet, because that's not the standard. Okay. Transition smoothly. I should have bolded the word smoothly there. Transition smoothly from the approach or landing out attitude to a pitch attitude that will induce a stall. This is not an abrupt maneuver because it's not realistic. It's not a realistic scenario. It's not like you would be, well, we hope, flying in the pattern, maybe turning from base to final, and that you're going to just take the yoke and yank it all the way back. Right? That's not what we're attempting to get at in this scenario. We're attempting to get at the fact that it somewhat is subtle. You end up in a stall condition because you've allowed the airspeed to degrade and you've increased the angle of attack to a point where you have reached critical angle of attack, which is a stall by definition. Okay, the way it works now is for private pilots, you are expected to recover after a full stall. So there actually is the expectation of a stall break. Commercial pilots, the check pilot is supposed to specify to you whether they want the recovery at either first indication or full stall. Any thoughts on what first indication is? Anybody want to throw out an idea? What do we consider first indication?
Stall warning horn or buffet?
The buffet.
Sure. There's typically actually two buffets. There's two series of buffets that often happen. The first one can be really subtle. Often happens even before the stall warning horn. But typically I would say the stall warning horn would be the first one. And so I would normally think that would be first indication. And then you're going to see after the stall warning horn, you start to see another buffet before you actually move into the stall. I would even if I said first indication and went so far as that, that's what I'm looking for. The stall warning horn through to the first buffet. And then finally, the check pilot may ask you to actually do a full stall. Sometimes I switch between. For the power off stall, I may do it one way for a commercial pilot, and then for example, a power on, I'll do it the other way. Okay. A lot of the common problems don't usually happen. I did talk a little bit about being abrupt versus being smooth in the approach to it, but where I find more of the common errors occur is during the recovery. One of the first things is failure to establish a positive rate of climb. And again, I think you have to get into the mindset of what the scenario is that we're practicing here or evaluating here, is that you're relatively low to the ground. You've made an error during an approach to landing. You've stalled the aircraft. The first thing you need to do is get established into a positive rate of climb. Right? So it's not just a question of breaking the stall where you push the nose down to regain flying airspeed and potentially adding power. But I find that either people still have their nose down, or at best they're really just going to level. we actually expect you to establish a positive rate of climb. Doesn't have to be fast. We're not looking for you to get into a secondary stall by yanking the nose back up again, which happens. We're looking for you to smoothly transition to positive rate of climb. Here's one of my big ones, inappropriate flap retraction. So keep in mind that the flaps are making a huge change to the chord angle of the wing itself, right? So as you change those flaps, you are making big changes to the angle of attack of the aircraft. So if you retract those flaps too early or too much, you can end up with either a sink or a worst case scenario, not the worst, but a worser case scenario, you can end up back into a stall again. So again, flap retraction should be in increments. And again, they should not be the first, as I say below, the first notch of flaps, as soon as you have broken the stall, added power, and you're pitching for climb, the first notch of flaps can come in if you're at full flaps, because those are creating so much drag that some aircraft, or on a hot day, may not actually climb. So the first notch can come right away. The rest of the flaps should not come until you've reached the airspeed that we specify in the checklist. For the 172, I think it's 60 knots. The 182 is 70 knots. Just like other high angle of attack maneuvers, think rudder. Oh, the recurring theme here. Okay, power on, or in this case, departure stall. So what are we doing? We're departing our runway. Right? We're not at a high altitude or anything else. So you can imagine, as part of the scenario, think about it. Minimum loss of altitude in this maneuver is probably pretty important. Okay. There is flexibility in the ACS about the starting configuration. So feel free to consult with your check pilot about what the recommended method they would like. I will tell you what I recommend. I recommend that we start close to rotation speed. Couple of reasons. One is it aids in the reality of the simulation, in my opinion. The second thing is, if you take, for example, well, the 172 as well, but even the 182, and you start this maneuver at cruise airspeed, you'll find you're going to be pointing yourself basically right up to the moon in order to the point where you're starting to slow the aircraft to the point where we get to a stall. It's not really the objective anyway. What we're looking to do is say, during the climb out, during a departure, you know, I wasn't paying attention. I was getting my radio set up. I was watching for other traffic or whatever. And I continually increased the angle of attack until I worked into the stall zone. So again, that's why I recommend slowing the aircraft close down to rotation speed. Make note of your altitude. This is your runway. By the time this maneuver is over, I expect you to be above. By the time you start establishing a climb, I still expect you to be above that runway altitude. Okay, and again, notice the word slowly here. Slowly but steadily increase pitch, right? Again, it's not a race here. What we're really looking for, as long as the airspeed is decreasing, then you're going to eventually get into a stall configuration. So again, just continue the airspeed coming back, and then the airspeeds to start to slow. Just keep continuing smooth pressure back on the yoke. Okay, and actually, I just realized in my slides here, I forgot one thing I wanted to mention here, is that we do not necessarily use full power for power on or departure stalls. In fact, in the 182 and the 206, we do not. Now, your check pilot will give you what the maximum power they'd like to see is. Typically, I keep it in the 21, 22-inch range is the most that I would like to see on those aircraft. On the 172, typically we'll do it at close to full power. Okay, and for private pilots, again, recover after full stall. For commercial pilots, this is check pilot discretion. Okay, Common problems. You'll notice on the Form 5 that there's actually an evaluation item for spin awareness. This is one of the places that I'm watching for this, is are you keeping the aircraft coordinated? All right. And why is that? In particular in this maneuver, it's important in all the maneuvers, but particularly in this one, you are in a high power configuration. You are putting that slipstream is making your rudder very, very effective. Lack of coordination in this case is a recipe for a spin. Right? I will give you an example. I don't know if any of you have ever done any aerobatic training or emergency maneuvers training, but some of the typical planes that you use, like we used to use things like a Cessna 150 Aerobat. You would put that thing up into the air, up the nose up, and it would, start to vibrate and shudder, and you'd shove it in, you'd shove a rudder in all the way to induce a spin, and it pretty much wouldn't go anywhere. You'd increase the RPM just enough, maybe like 50 RPM, that slipstream across the tail or across the rudder, boom, broke right into a spin. It is really that effective. So imagine now when we're sitting at 21 or 22 inches of power in a 182 or 206, or even the 172 at full power, if you are not coordinated, imagine how easy it will be for it to break into a spin. So if things start going badly in your maneuver, or perhaps you're out there practicing for the maneuver, reduce the power and let the nose drop. If you catch it early on and realize that you feel like you're losing control of what's going on, just pull the power back to idle, let the nose come down. The airplane starts flying again. And again, remember, we're not doing this close to the ground. You have altitude to recover. And let's do a quick review here. If things start going really badly, everybody remember PAIR? Have any of you heard of it since your primary training? This is the standard recovery technique that we're taught. Now, keep in mind, I say at the bottom, the POH does take precedence for all procedures. However, you will note for Cessnas that PAIR is pretty much what the POH is recommending, and I'll show you that after this. So, what are the PAIR ones? P, power to idle. Ailerons, neutralize the ailerons. Made a note here, they tend to aggravate the spin, right? Because effectively, what is the spin? You have one wing, I mean, this is a bit of an overgeneralization, but you have one wing stalled, you have one wing that's not. So what do your ailerons tend to do? They increase or decrease the angle of attack on a given wing. So you very often, using the ailerons, can actually aggravate the spin. Rudder. This is actually how you get out of a spin. You use it in the opposite direction. And then finally, the elevator needs to come down so that you push forward to break the stall. At that point, with wings level, you can now recover the aircraft and add power once you've established more of a climb pitch. If we take a quick look at what goes on in the Cessna manuals, and I think they all look about the same. I actually went through and did our old 206U model as well as our latest 172S. Pretty much looks about the same. And if you take a look at these steps, that's pretty much the PAIR method. The only difference is that with 5 and 6, they just add on the fact that you hold until the rotation stops. Then you can go ahead and make your smooth recovery. Questions? Okay, steep turns. Some people consider this their nemesis. Actually not that hard if you practice them and you have good technique. So let's talk about it. Stabilize the aircraft at an airspeed below VA. Now, there's a published VA on the placard on the aircraft. Is that always the VA or does it vary?
It varies with weight.
And what's it based on weight? And which way does it go? When the aircraft is lighter, which way does VA go?
Up.
Excuse me?
Up.
Up? We think so? Or is VA published at max gross and that if we're in a lighter aircraft, it actually is slower.
That's true.
Down
I backwards.
between 110 and 90 roughly in the 182.
As the gross weight goes downward.
Right.
Okay, so it actually is slower. So typically, if we're not flying at gross, and you often aren't, especially if it's only you and your either instructor pilot or check pilot in there, so you can expect that the VA for your maneuver is going to be lower than whatever's placarded on there. Okay. Now, when you roll into your turn, and again, this is after you've done your clearing turn because we know steep turns are not self-clearing. As you roll through 3 degrees of bank, I recommend a small power increase. Again, a lot of different techniques for this. I'm just giving you ones that I find to be reliable. If you don't increase a little bit of power, your speed will drop off. And keep in mind that if you look at the ACS, you are expected to keep your speed plus or minus 10 knots. So again, maybe about 100 to 200 RPM for the 172, which is about 1 to 2 inches of manifold pressure in the 182-206. And as you come out of the turn, you're going to want to reverse that power again so that you stay within the speed of where you started the maneuver. Now, as you roll through there, you've rolled to 3 degrees of bank, you've added in your slight bit of power, consider 2 turns of the nose wheel or of trim nose up. It is not a requirement, but here's my thinking on this one. By putting 2 wheels of nose trim, you basically come much closer to a hands-off situation. And when you're practicing, especially if you go up with an instructor pilot, here's what I want you to practice. I want you to practice doing a steep turn hands-off or nearly hands-off. You may need to tap the yoke. If you get this trim approximately two turns of the trim, and you've added your power in, this thing will pretty much go round and round and round and keep a reasonably good altitude with a little bit of, a little bit of tweaking, just a little bit of back pressure, right? So again, you're not fighting the aircraft, you're just training the aircraft to fly itself. The other issue about using trim is this. About halfway through, what we find is, and it happens to everybody, you're using large muscle moves rather than fine motor control. With large muscle moves, your muscles get tired, and what happens is you start to usually let them drop. So what I will tell people who don't trim is that you can just expect at 180 degrees in the turn, halfway through the turn, just expect to pull harder, mainly because you've probably stopped pulling. But again, my recommendation is use trim. Now, coming out of the turn, you need to, at the same time, you're rolling level, you're reducing the power back an inch or two, and you're dialing out the same 2 wheels of trim that you used to go in. Because you don't want to balloon. This is a common problem. People balloon at the end, and you violated your 100-foot criteria or your 50-foot criteria for commercial. Here's one. I'm not sure where this came into common thinking, but there is no requirement that you must immediately reverse your turn in the opposite direction. Now, if you've practiced it, you're good at it, it's fine. As a check pilot, if your first turn is really good, I might not make you go the opposite direction. Just depends. But again, there's no requirement that you go right into the other way, and I tend to recommend against it. I tend to recommend that you come through the turn, stabilize the aircraft again, which meant reducing the power, the same amount you put in, readjusting the trim, looking around, and going ahead and rolling into your turn the opposite direction once you've stabilized it again. Because I find that people do tend to, I don't know if it's disorientation as much as just that rapid turn where they're rolling in one direction, rolling out the other, and then rolling right into the next one. Usually it starts to get a little out of control in that next one. And that's where I start to see some pretty big altitude deviations. And again, remember, we're teaching the aircraft to fly itself. So keep the aircraft trimmed, smooth inputs, not rushed.
Keith, would you recommend only doing the procedure that is requested by the check pilot? No more, correct?
Of course, in all cases, but do you have a specific point in there, Peter? I want to make sure I understand.
Well, a steep turn, as you just mentioned, some people just roll, do one to the right, then roll and do one to the left. So maybe the best advice would be to do one in the direction that you feel most comfortable as pilot at command, and then stabilize the aircraft after that turn. And then the check pilot can either ask it to do another one or not ask it to do one at all. But don't do another one because it might not be needed. Don't volunteer to do another.
Yeah, and I won't. I think that's a fair statement. The issue is the evaluation is already fraught with tension and stress already. Don't make it any harder on yourself.
Exactly.
So yes, I think that's true. However, if people want, if they're doing a steep turn one way and they roll right in the other way, I'm not going to say anything.
Understand. But if they screw up the one going in the other direction, then that counts as screwing up the whole maneuver, correct?
Agreed. Yes.
So again, don't do more than you're asked for, right?
I think that's a fair statement.
All right, sir.
And it's a little bit like the IRS audit. If I ask you a yes or no question on a check ride, go ahead and answer it yes or no.
Yeah.
And then we can discuss what happens with the answer. But the more and this happens, FAA examiners will tell you all the time, this happens. If they let people start talking, they'll usually talk themselves into a hole. Okay. Practice, and then fly it the same way in the evaluation ride. So to Peter's point, right? Don't do more than you have to, but if you're practicing and you roll in one way and you roll out and roll in the opposite direction, and that's the way you do it every time you practice, then do it the same way on the check ride. Right? That's not the time to get creative. Okay? And while we realize that you have a lot of attention spending on this maneuver, we are expecting you to keep your eyes outside and scanning for traffic. And back to the points that have been made, that I made and George has made, is that looking outside is going to be your best indication. Because as we're going around the turn, when I'm working prep work with people, I will make comments like, well, I can see the nose dropping. I can see the nose dropping. And that's not from looking at the attitude indicator. Looking outside is your best indication of what's happening. Here's a tip. If you find basically things are not going well in the turn and your deviations are starting to become erratic, right? End the maneuver. Ask the check pilot for another try. Now, admittedly, I can't speak for all the check pilots. It is really up to them, but I am never going to fail somebody for demonstrating sound aeronautical decision making. If that maneuver is not going well, then I would rather that you safely exit the maneuver and execute it again. You have any argument to that, George? I'll assume not. Okay.
Keith, I have a question. Actually, regarding the previous slide, please.
Which one?
The one about spins. I was just thinking about. Oh, there we go. So yeah, the P power to idle. Can you please explain the effect of power to idle onto the spin? Sometimes understanding the physics behind it's easier to understand why and remembering to do this their given step. I understand all the others, but what about the power? What's the physical effect on the spin, reducing the power?
Well, we put ourselves into a position where we have the corkscrewing is caused by essentially your one wing is stalled and the other one is flying. And really, it's not as absolute as that because usually both wings are flying to some extent. But one wing is flying considerably more than the other one, which is what causes that corkscrewing when we come over the top. But part of what puts us into that situation is the yawing motion. The yawing motion is what causes it's part of what causes the change in the angle of attack differential between one wing and the other. That's essentially the rudder. So what happens is the slipstream coming off from a power point of view, the slipstream is what's making that rudder highly effective. But also in the case of the power, all that the power is really doing is actually turning you through. It's actually tractoring the aircraft through and essentially will be accelerating it, right? And in fact, the flat spin, if you want to actually move into a flat spin, is actually utilized with power. You actually need power in order to raise the nose to the point where you can enter it into a flat spin, which, by the way, might not be recoverable. Should be in our general aviation aircraft, but it might not be. So the power, essentially, for a number of reasons, actually does us no good in the recovery from the spin. All it's really doing is continuing to aggravate. It's an indirect contributor to aggravating the spin situation, both in the fact that it amplifies any lack of coordination, essentially is tractoring our aircraft and is essentially tractoring our aircraft through in the spin. So the best move is to get the power to idle. The other thing the power to idle does for you, by the way, is because it also removes the slipstream from the elevator as well. So the nose is going to tend to drop. And again, that's part of our recovery technique for it. We have to get the airplane down so whether it's flying into the slipstream, we're reducing the angle of attack on not one, but on both wings. So I guess I would call it multi-factored. If we've got any aeronautical engineers in the audience who have better descriptions, I'm always happy to hear it.
And Keith, sorry I was muted before. I agree with your point about retrying as long as it doesn't keep happening. It shouldn't be a habit, but absolutely otherwise.
Okay, yeah. At the point where we're starting to get low on fuel, I usually have a concern. No, just kidding. Yes. Okay. So you have anything to add on the power reduction for the pair, George?
No, I think it's exactly as you said it, and I think for some planes, I read something a long time ago that there is theoretically, like if you add power during the spin, there's a theoretical chance that because you're making the elevator more effective, you might actually make the spin inverted. So yeah, but everything else, totally agree.
Okay. Antonio, we good?
Absolutely. Thank you. I appreciate it.
No problem. Okay, I think we went through steep turns. We'll not do that one again. Takeoffs and landings. Okay. I went a little bit shorter on some of these. Again, I wasn't trying to be heavily procedural, more just wanted to talk about some tips that are here and the common problems that we have. So it's not that I consider these any less important, quite the contrary. Definitely an area we want to practice. So our short field takeoffs. Use all available runway. People often forget this. Okay, I'd rather you not take out the runway end identifier lights, but short of that, I would like you to use all of the available runway, because remember what we're simulating. If we're sitting on a 5,000-foot runway, that's hardly a short field takeoff. So this is really all a simulation maneuver, or a scenario maneuver, I should say. All available runway. I expect you to power up, and the way it's required is to power up with the brakes applied, a quick check of engine instruments to make sure that all is good, because again, this is the time to abort before you start rolling. If it doesn't look perfect, abort. Okay, wow, we're talking about this again. This is going to become, when you take off, a high angle of attack maneuver. Rudder coordination is imperative. All right, again, that item on the Form 5 that says spin awareness, I'm watching for this here. Now, keep in mind, in this particular maneuver, we are really close to the ground. We are not going to be doing any spin recoveries in this case, right? So this is critical that our rudder coordination in this maneuver is perfect. Because you are high angle of attack, we're putting a lot of slipstream over that rudder, making it highly effective and easy to uncoordinate. Okay. In the unlikely event of a power loss, again, we have a high angle of attack maneuver. Our nose is way up in the air. you can expect to perform a significant push. Chances are, if you're flying with your instructor or a check pilot, you're going to feel the yoke coming out of your hands because they're going to have already pushed it. It is significant, right, to get this over so that you're not immediately into a stall. Now, after climbing over the obstacle, and I think you heard me talk about this before, do not retract the flaps until recommended speed, right? I got to admit, this is a problem I've had, and I usually tend to brief people too, is that they come over their height of the obstacle, and while their still nose is high in the air, they start retracting flaps. Again, we know this leads to, at the very least, this is likely to lead to sink, and at the worst, it can put us immediately into a stall. So pitch the nose, allow the airspeed to increase, and then start bringing up the flaps in increments. Okay. Climb out speed until clearing obstacle doesn't have to be equal to Vx. Now, in the case of most of our checklists, it's actually a little slower than Vx. I think this was one of your edits, George. Did you have something more to say on this one?
Yeah, so like in the Cessna 182 with the G1000, if you look at the procedure for the short field takeoff, the speed it calls out until you clear the obstacle is 58 knots, which is less than Vx. Yes. I know there's some other planes, like older 172s and 182s, that the two are the same, but in this plane it's not. So don't assume that it's always the same.
Yes, and that's true. And keep in mind that it's pretty much a -0 on the low side. I don't expect anybody slower than the procedure speed, because it's already pretty slow at that point. Okay, let's talk about short field landings. The key to success in a short field landing is airspeed and power management. If you are fluctuating your airspeed all over the place, you are unlikely to have a successful short field landing. You need to have a stabilized aircraft, and you need to be managing power. And again, I probably should have emphasized this word. You will be making minor adjustments all the way down. What do I mean by minor? 25 RPM? Maybe 50. Oh, I did actually. Sorry, I did say that. Emphasis on minor. Again, and you need to just go out and practice this maneuver. Minor adjustments and a stabilized airspeed. Okay, if it's not looking good, if the airspeed, you're having trouble getting the airspeed stabilized, if you're sinking and then ballooning and you're not happy with where it's going, consider doing a go around. Right? If you're not going to be within your landing area, consider doing a go around, because consider what the issue is in the real scenario. The real scenario is you have a short field. If you land long, you very well may be off the end of the runway. If you land short, you may not be on the runway. So consider going around. This is another one of those. We don't expect you to have to do it many times, but if you need to abort or reject that landing to do a go around, then do it. Come around, we'll do it again when you're stabilized. Now, here's the bonus for this one. If we haven't already done a go around for you, and had you do a rejected landing, oh, guess what? You've just done one. So if you use good technique on your go around, you just got extra credit, or you just got the credit you need, and you can come around and do your short field landing again. And again, very important here, poor technique on this can lead to a tail strike. Because what often happens is if you let the sink rate get out of control, as you start to come down, you're approaching your target, and you realize that you're coming down quite fast, often what happens is people will yank the yoke back. And if you still have sufficient aerodynamic control over your elevator, it can be enough to bang that tail down. So again, that's avoided by smooth, stabilized approach where you have a consistent airspeed and you're managing your power to arrest or to control your descent rate. Okay, and I want to make one comment on soft field takeoff. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but again, this is our other area that leads to tail strikes, is that people have the yoke all the way back as per the procedure as they taxi onto the runway. They apply full power, and what happens? That nose just pops right up. So expect on your soft field takeoff that as you apply power, you're also releasing the yoke. We don't need the nose in the air as far as it can go. We only want the nose wheel off the ground or out of the height of the grass. That's really all that we're looking for in this maneuver or in actual soft field takeoff. We do not want to be dragging the tail. So again, this is your other area that often can lead to a tail strike scenario.
I have a question, Keith.
Sure.
For the short field takeoff, what's a good reference for the climb bow speed for a specific aircraft? Where should what document should I refer to get to find that?
It's in the POH. If you look in the well, yes, they actually are in the POH, sorry. But what I was really referring to is if you look at the CAP checklists, you will find the CAP checklists have a short field takeoff item. And they will tell you, it's after the slash on them, they will tell you what the climb out speed is for a short field takeoff. Like, for example, they'll tell you in the that the rotation speed might be 50, but that the climb out speed is 58.
Okay.
I don't have a checklist to throw on the screen right in front of me right now, but you will find them on the CAP checklist.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
The POH on the 182 is flaps 20 degrees, apply brakes, throttle full, propeller control 2400 RPM, mixture control rich above 5,000 feet, lean as used, brake release, elevator control slightly tail low, climb speed 58 knots indicated until all obstacles are cleared. Wing flaps retract slowly when airspeed is more than 70 knots indicated.
Yeah, those two items are definitely on the CAP checklist. Some of the rest of it is a little bit abbreviated, but definitely those items, the key ones, climb speed and also flap retraction speed. So thank you. Okay, you may be asked to demonstrate a power off landing to the pavement in your maneuver. Now, my number one tip I've got two big ones, but the number one is please don't aim for the threshold. I kind of go over this over and over again, yet it still keeps happening. Is chances are, I mean, it might work, but chances are I find it doesn't work because people start descending and descending, and then they think life is good. They throw their flaps in, and essentially we never make it to the threshold. I recommend 500-foot markers, third of the way down, quarter of the way down, somewhere over the surface so that when you do, if you do come up short, you still have runway beneath you. The truth is, I recommend this. Any of you who've been through my emergency procedures clinic, I recommend this in a true off-field landing as well. Is that if you're in a limited space for off-field landing, or maybe you're planning to land somewhere where there's obstructions at the very end of it, don't aim for that full length of it. Give yourself some room in there for a miscalculation. Because again, this is all a physics problem. Your chance of survivability is all about energy management. It is way better to hit a tree at the end of your landing zone at 5 or 10 knots than it is to run into an obstruction at 70 knots at the approach end. So again, don't aim for the threshold. If you and again, you have lots of tools to lose altitude, and these are good things to practice with. You know, slips, full flaps, S-turns, any or all of those are going to allow you to lose quite a bit of altitude. You don't have a lot to gain it back when you find you're coming in short. Again, this is power off. Now, here's another one. I talked about the twos. Maintain sufficient airspeed to arrest your descent. I think for the 206, it is actually considerably higher than glide speed, best glide speed. You need to maintain that airspeed so that you can actually pitch the aircraft to arrest the descent and touch down main gear first. Now, that means that until you're down in ground effect, you're going to want to maintain, not saying an excessive amount of airspeed, but you certainly want to maintain at the very least in most of your aircraft best glide. I think in the 182, I would certainly recommend being a little higher than best glide. And in the 206, definitely more than that. The common error I also find is I'm finding a number of people are bleeding off airspeed while still 30 to 50 feet in the air. Now, keep in mind, you don't have power to cushion that landing. If you run out of airspeed at 30 feet in the air, or even a little lower than that, it's going to be a damaging landing. Now, keep in mind, we can't let you damage the aircraft, which means we would essentially have to intervene, which is an automatic failure for a check ride. So keep this in mind. You want to bring it down at a reasonable airspeed, so best glide or better depending on the POH, and maintain that airspeed down into the ground effect. And ground effect is not 30 feet. How high is ground effect? Anybody?
Half the wingspan.
Half the wingspan.
Wingspan.
Right? So, you know, at best, we're talking maybe 15 feet. Okay. So, go around. Now, we talked about a little bit earlier, your short field landing, if not well stabilized, might be a reason for a go around. Could be traffic on the runway, whatever. We may simulate one for you when coming in. It looks like it's going to be a perfectly normal landing. We may ask you to go around. I'm going to give you a tip here. Remember your 5 C's. Okay. First of all, always ensure this should have already been done in your checklist. Make sure your prop control is forward. You're putting a lot of strain on the propeller system if you apply full power with it other than its normal flat pitch. Okay, so prop forward, full throttle, or specified takeoff power, whatever that happens to be, right? And I say that because in most of our aircraft, full throttle is going to be fine. In turbocharged aircraft, you have to be a little careful. That's a common place for overboost. But again, right now in Group 2, we don't have turbocharged aircraft. So for the aircraft that we have, you can go to full throttle. So smoothly to full throttle. Climb. Establish a climb. I know I talked about this earlier with the power off stalls, but again, this is an area I see common, is that people may add the power, but then they're kind of cruising down the runway and not actually establishing a rate of climb. Now, one of the recommended techniques for the G1000 aircraft is you can press the go-around button. And you can press it in any configuration, whether the autopilot or flight director had previously been on or not. If you press the go-around button, it's going to give you a flight director indication of about 7.5 degrees pitch up. So again, it's a nice visual reminder to actually get that nose up and establish a climb. Okay, clean. Okay, just like I talked about in the power off stall, once you've established yourself for a climb, you can go ahead and pull up the first notch of flaps only right away. And I say that because in some aircraft, or given the heat or density altitude, you might not be able to establish a positive rate of climb with all flaps in. So again, first notch of flaps up. Now you're waiting for your minimum airspeed requirements. Just like you were on the short field takeoff, what do they say for the 182? You should be at 70 knots before you start bringing the flaps up. Cool. All right. Now your mixture should already be set appropriately. Now the reason I didn't say mixture rich is that at a high altitude airport where we've already leaned for takeoff, by going to full rich, we're actually reducing the amount of available power we have. So that's why I say appropriately. For our sea level airports here, then yes, you're going mixture rich. Open your cowl flaps. And finally, confess or communicate, some people use. And the radio is the lowest priority. Again, you will hear things out of me that you probably don't want to hear if you start keying up the radio to call in a go around while you're still sinking towards the runway. I will be unimpressed. Let's put it that way. Okay. Any questions on maneuvers? We're oh, I do have one more thing to say about go around. I'm sorry. The ACS does specify that you are to offset from the runway or landing area to clear and avoid traffic. Now, keep in mind that when you do that offset, typically you're going to do it away from traffic. So what that normally means is that you're going to do it opposite the traffic pattern. If you have right traffic, you're going to want to offset to the left. However, the overriding factor in that is if you have parallel runways, you certainly aren't going to offset to the runway. So take, for example, Livermore, where we have 2 parallel runways. Whereas I normally, if I were landing on 25, I might normally, 25 right, I might normally want to offset to the left to avoid the downwind traffic pattern. You would do it the other way. You'd offset slightly into the traffic pattern direction, right? So that you can actually then clear the traffic that might be on the field or whatever the reason for your go around is. But just to keep in mind that the offset portion of it is actually specified in the ACS. Okay, I'm going to move on to the AIF now unless there are any questions. Okay, aircraft information file, the binder we have in all of the aircraft, typically white. Per 70-1, we must have that in the aircraft. The contents and the format of the AIF are specified in CAP Standard 72-4, and I'm going to show you some of the highlights as we go through here. Okay, so on the front cover, I'm sure most of you who have been to a CAP aircraft now have seen this. This is essentially our maintenance record. This is one of the first things that we're going to do when we get into the aircraft is to go ahead and take note of this to make sure that we actually have an aircraft that we can fly. All right. So, for example, oil changes. Anybody, oil changes are typically scheduled at how many TAC hours on the aircraft?
50 and 100.
50 and 100. Well, or every 50, if you will. Right? Do we have any leeway on the oil change?
40 to 60 on the 50.
On the 50 hour, right. So we're good for there. Okay, how about the 100-hour inspection?
They don't want us to go any over on that.
That is correct. We don't want to do. If you come to an aircraft that is right on the 100-hour inspection, you need to stop before you fly it and get a hold of the aircraft manager or someone involved with the aircraft management for that aircraft. Because if you end up running it over 100 hours, that aircraft is going to be effectively grounded if they do not do the maintenance on that airport. It will require a ferry permit to get it somewhere. So
and there also needs to be enough hours left before the 100 hours to get it to the central.
Yes, absolutely. So if you're getting close to it, so normally the aircraft manager should be watching this, but it's, you can't see everything all the time. So it pays to be wary of this. And if you have a question, ask. Okay. And by the way, for John, if you're on, you may know this. I don't know if it's only California Wing or all CAP does this, but in California Wing, our 100 hours are also annuals.
That is correct.
So we do those at the same time. Say again?
That is correct. Annual and 100 hours done together.
I don't know. Is that only California Wing or?
I wouldn't know.
Don't know. Okay, fair enough. And we have a grounded card. If you need to make clear that this aircraft has been grounded, then this card needs to be pulled out and put on top of this binder. Again, this is why we always come to this binder first. Or this piece of information when we first open the aircraft. Okay, Inside, you will find the table of contents that will tell you what's in each and every tab. I don't really expect you to be able to read it. I know it's a poor picture. But the key is that as soon as you open up this binder, there is a table of contents. And for example, it will tell you that in tab number 1, you have your aircraft flight time log, which any of you who have flown by now have already realized that you have to, we used to call these, I guess, tack sheets or hob sheets, that you'll be filling that out under tab 1. Another tab that's you're often going to be looking at will be tab 3. This is your VOR and your fire extinguisher record. Now, I am finding that an awful lot of our pilots are not, when I usually ask on this one, are not aware of this. This fire extinguisher check is to be done monthly. If you get to the aircraft, I don't care if it's even the 15th of the month. If you get to the aircraft and there is not an entry for your month, you as PIC are responsible for doing this inspection. It's not a big deal. It requires pulling the fire extinguisher out of its holder, and it requires doing the, what is that, 8 steps? Requires doing approximately the 8 steps that are listed right there on it. But it is your responsibility to do it. VOR tests, well, there's a lot of rules around. I'm not going to spend a lot of time going over that now. Certainly for VFR flying, we don't have to worry about that. But if you are out there and you're doing, especially if you're out doing practice flights and you're doing instrument work or whatever, you know, take the time and record a VOR test if you can. Okay. Believe it or not, that's all I'm going to say about the AIF for tonight. Again, it's worthy, like Jordan said about 160-2, the Mishap reporting. It's worth reading about the AIF and taking a look at what's all the things that are in, and going through the AIF when you get to the plane. Aircraft maintenance, CAPR 66-1. Okay, already talked about this briefly earlier. These were a couple of the first things, is oil changes. Okay, they call them mid-cycle, and they're mid-cycle between the 100-hour inspections. And they should be done, as we talked about, between 40 and 60 hours. And we even talked about this one, the 100-hour inspections. So there is an FAR exemption for up to 10 hours to overfly 100-hour for very specific circumstances. It has to do with basically transporting the aircraft to where it needs to go. However, the aircraft can't have exceeded the 100 hours to start with. So the reason I call it a trap here, or don't be fooled by it, is there's also other things that you may not know about. For example, if there are airworthiness directives tied to the 100-hour inspection time or the 100-hour interval, those do not extend by that 10 hours. So the safe tactic is assume that 100 hours is a hard limit. And as someone mentioned earlier, assume that you need some of that 100 hours to get that aircraft to its inspection depot or inspection facility. So if you are close to that 100-hour number, consider calling the aircraft manager before you fly. And then, as I mentioned, yeah, in COG, it's the 100 hours or annuals. I don't know about if it's done elsewhere, other wings that same way. Okay. Among many other interesting things in this manual, there are some special restrictions. This is one that's worthy of noting, is that if any of these items happen, the engine is changed or had an overhaul, anything with cylinders, any new cylinder that for any reason has been replaced, removed, whatever, or mags, any of those things occur, there will be no cadet flying or AFROTC, AFROTC flying. Did it used to? I guess the teacher flights programs is not included, but basically no cadets or no AFROTC cadets will be flown for 10 TAC hours. Okay. Here's another item of note I find that a number of people aren't always aware of, is that in our aircraft you will find that we have tie-down straps. And part of that reason, other than the fact that they're useful, is that if you end up at a spot where the tie-down chains are attached to a hard point or a mooring point, you may not use those. You may not tie down a CAP aircraft using chains directly to hard points on the surface, right? You can tie them down with chains when you're tying them down to tie down wires that may slip through hard points. But again, the chains have to be attached to the wires. If not, use those, I guess they're canvas, but you use the straps that we have in the aircraft. Okay, so I put this up here. I'm not going to read through each one, but I wanted to emphasize something. So this is the attachment that discusses what may be performed by a CAP pilot and, as they say, uninsured mechanics. But for CAP pilots, now, this list is considerably shorter than what the FARs allow an owner pilot to do for an aircraft, right? An owner can do their own oil change if they want. Not so here, right? It's very limited. So be aware of what it is. There's really, truthfully, as they say, tire inflation is one here. So definitely you are able to do tire inflation. But there's very little here that you're actually allowed to do to the CAP aircraft. So again, if in question, contact the aircraft manager before doing anything. Okay. Lieutenant Forenza had recommended, let's see, the homework assignments for the practice flights. So do you want to, do you have anything to say on this beyond what's here? I think,
Yeah, so, yeah, thank you, Keith. Very helpful presentation. So as Keith said at the beginning, this is we're kind of in the middle of the training. So this is a good time for those of you who are interested in scheduling the Form 5 at the end of this training, or somewhere after this, sometime after this training. This will be a good time to really get some practice. And the reason why we put this module in the middle of the training is just for that, to allow you to go flying, basically. Really practice everything that Keith taught us tonight about the maneuvers, the takeoffs, landing, and become very proficient with the plane and meet the standards required for the Form 5. So the recommendations for the homeworks, say for the end of this training, you can get started now, and so are going to be watching 2 modules on Access. One is the aircrew professionalism, and the other is the air ground handling training, which I believe you need to do every 24 months. And then we recommend scheduling one sortie with a CAP instructor, so he or she can demo the maneuvers, and then do a lot of practice with your own plane or with your club plane until you get very proficient with those maneuvers and those takeoffs and landing within the predefined tolerances required for the check ride. And then finally, maybe optionally schedule a second sortie with the CAP instructor to evaluate those maneuvers, so to see if if you are indeed meeting the standards for the Form 5. So that would be a recommended practical training for you. And then the other homework, so all these homeworks are, say, due at the end of the training if you wish, like in preparation to the actual practical check ride. And then there's one more homework that I'm going to be posting on the chat, which is for the next module. The next module is all about aircraft systems, and so the module, the homework is essentially read the section 7 of the POH. It's going to be a very interesting class. We're going to learn about electrical system, airframe, fuel system, how does the variable pitch propeller work, high performance engines. And so I highly recommend attending that class as well. We'll go through a lot of details about how airplanes work. So thank you everyone for your participation.